Hi, I'm Kevin Roth. Hi, I'm Kevin Roth, Managing Director of Research here at CFP Board. I'm excited to introduce today's webinar, where we'll learn about one of CFP Board's major initiatives, an ambitious research study focused on the impact holistic financial planning has on clients and on society more broadly. Specifically, CFP Board is leading the first academic study to track and report on the efficacy of holistic financial planning. At the center of this project is a multi-year longitudinal panel survey that will track, follow, and measure the change in financial conditions and the life goals of a cohort of households across the nation. The survey work will launch later this summer, but we anticipate collecting data for upwards of 10 years. The data collected will serve as the basis of an empirical evaluation of the benefits of financial planning and the services of CFP professionals as compared to the services of professionals who do not hold a CFP certification and those who follow a do-it-yourself approach. During today's webinar, we will learn about the progress that the research team has made thus far. This includes the framework they're developing to evaluate client outcomes and some takeaways from a pilot survey. I hope you find today's conversation intriguing and engaging, and I encourage you to share your feedback on what you hear. While the chat is disabled, please enter your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If we have a few minutes left over after the presentation, we'll go through some of their questions. And with that, let me turn the floor over to the research team. Let's start with Stu.
Thanks, Dr. Roth. My name's Stuart Heckman. I'm an associate professor of practice and the Ph.D. program director at Texas Tech University.
My name is Emily Koochel, and I lead eMoney's financial wellness team, focusing on our wellness research and education efforts inside of eMoney Advisor, and also serve as adjunct faculty at NYU in the financial planning program.
And I am Sonya Lutter, and I am the Director of Financial Health and Wellness and the Master's Program Director at Texas Tech University, and the owner of Enlight, where I bridge the gap between mental health as a licensed marriage and family therapist and financial planning. So with that, we are, again, very excited to dig into this research and ideally get a lot of your feedback towards the end. So let's start with what we know about financial planning outcomes. There was a study several years ago that looked at specifically CFP professionals' contribution to the field and to clients, but as you can see among their key findings, they were really focused on compensation and revenue. And there was one element that looked at client outcomes, but it was from the perspective of the CFP professional. So that's really nice that we can see some of this increased trust and confidence among clients from the perspective of the CFP professional. But what we lack is an understanding of consumers' individually reported benefits of using CFP professionals as compared to other types of professional services, or taking more of the hands-on approach that Dr. Roth mentioned with the DIY approach. So when we are looking at the client outcomes, we looked at the primary goal of financial planning as guided from the CFP Board's Code of Standards. And within this, looking at specifically these non-financial elements, which includes well-being and satisfaction. This first point really illustrates the potential non-financial benefits of seeing the CFP professional. I think the financial benefits are fairly obvious, but we want to bring in some of those non-financial benefits in this longitudinal study. This is particularly so with the addition of the psychology of financial planning principle knowledge topic. And within that definition of psychology of financial planning, you'll see it ends with an increase in clients' financial well-being. So ultimately, the communication around money is an important outcome to achieve for in our study design. Within our high-level project design, we're comparing both financial outcomes and non-financial outcomes associated with the financial planning process of a diverse and representative sample. And we are not limiting the participation to those who use a CFP professional, but rather capturing all types of financial resources, including non-CFP professionals and the DIY crowd. We are going to follow the same sample for a minimum of 10 years to study the various sources of information and the impact this has on those financial and non-financial metrics. There are, as you can imagine, a number of issues associated with this longitudinal design and classifying people into the different help-seeking groups of the CFP professional versus the other groups that Dr. Heckman will discuss later on in the presentation. The purpose of today's webinar is to give you this high-level overview, but then also to introduce some of our pilot work that we have done so far and show you the timeline of where we're going from here. So at the high level of our pilot data, we have already done part one, which is solidifying the framework and looking at financial wellness as a broad umbrella of that's suitable for working with financial planning outcomes. We got some good information on those measures and some of the ideal outcomes that we will be looking for with the consumers. And we're going to show you some of that pilot data, but please keep in mind this is pilot data. This is not meant to be final information or necessarily even information to implement and practice yet. This was really meant to get our measures solid and make sure that they were valid and reliable to move forward to some of the pilot 2 work, and then ultimately in our first wave of data collection, which is scheduled for this summer. We also are in the process of collecting pilot 2 data, which looks at the efficacy of financial planning focused on the selection and treatment issues. So again, this is really looking at how do people classify their work with financial professionals. There's a lot of confusion among different designations, and oftentimes the consumers aren't well aware of the designations that their financial planner might have. There's been a lot of work in this area, so we're going to talk through some of those selection and treatment issues, the latter portion of the presentation. We do have a request for data collection proposals out right now, and we anticipate that first data coming in this summer.
All right, so as you would imagine, one of the primary goals for this project is to begin with defining financial wellness and ultimately understanding how it fits within the financial planning process. As Sonya mentioned, we spend a lot of time considering what's important when it comes to client outcomes, understanding that there are both the objectives, so financial goals, et cetera, and subjective outcomes that need to be captured. So for example, if we think about this, even if we look at objective financial goals, we understand that they're often driven by unique preferences of the individual who's actually setting those goals. And so as we look at this, we need to understand the subjective indicators such as one's perceptions, feelings of satisfaction, and contentment that are really important to capture inside of this definition. As we start out this process, we consider a couple of different methodologies. So for those of you that are familiar with this work, you will have seen that there are several words that appear to be very similar. So financial wellness, financial well-being, financial satisfaction. But upon closer inspection, you'll realize that they are dissimilar. And there is real importance in understanding those differences and also the overlap. In this process, there's no kind of required process for us determining a definition. So we considered several of the methods that are listed here. So I just want to go over a couple of those so you understand that when we showed the definition for financial wellness, what went into that selection process. Beginning at the top here, we have convergence, which is essentially looking at existing definitions and looking to arrive at a new definition incorporating each one of those that are pre-existing. While this result can, of course, be quite comprehensive, it does lend itself to be a little bit hard or challenging to create a measure for. Deletion is exactly what you would think it is, identifying existing definitions, anything that's closely related, and then determining anything that is irrelevant and using it as a bit of a reduction method, if you will. Accretion, think of this as kind of gradually adding and layering in different pieces of existing definitions until we've identified constructs that we believe are pertinent or relatable to the definition that we're looking for. And then consensus being a process where other definitions are considered and then we discard them depending on their usefulness. And this allows it to be quite a flexible definition and allows for different concepts and constructs to be reflected. So just to give you a bit of an overview of the definition process. But with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and move into the consumer financial wellness piece, which in addition to that process, we of course look out to the existing literature that helps us inform the definition that we'll propose, as well as the concept that you'll see later in the presentation. So just for background, many of you understand that financial wellness, of course, is going to be multi-layered, multi-dimensional concept. And if we look at this from some of the larger scale concepts of financial wellness, researchers as well as governments have actually used financial wellness, financial well-being as an assessment of health for populations for really centuries. And what they've done inside of those assessments is actually focus primarily on objective indicators of economic well-being to measure societal progress, sustainability, financial health, etc. So that's at the large scale. Now, if we move down to individual or the family level, when we look at financial well-being, we see a lot of research that shows financial well-being has been related to physical health, to mental health, relationship quality, happiness, satisfaction, etc. Now, conversely, if we look at stress or having insufficient resources, oftentimes we'll see concepts of lack of control over somebody's financial situation. Those have been, as you would expect, reported lower levels of financial well-being and satisfaction. So we know that we have a lot to consider here. You may also be familiar with the work of Ju, or if you have seen the work of the CFPB in 2017, we do want to acknowledge that, of course, we looked at those existing studies as well. So Ju presents an economic multidimensional framework, which we draw upon, as well as the CFPB's work in 2017. And they have some really great identifiers as well. So financial behaviors were identified as being really powerful in determining financial wellness. All of this in mind, as our understanding of well-being has matured, so too has our assessment of the societal progress that we've seen, identifiers of health, financial health more specifically, and we've seen this through the extension to other areas of work such as psychological, social, and emotional well-being. With that, I want to go ahead and present our financial wellness definition here. So what we've covered in that brief kind of literature review is the first half here, which is financial wellness as the combination of being healthy or functioning well, feeling good, or experiencing positive emotions. At the end of this, though, we see being free from worry or thinking that everything is okay. I want to touch on this just briefly here. Wellness, whether overall or financial, cannot be fully captured without reflecting on one's experience or thinking about those reactions that we have to that reflection of identifying our own wellness. In fact, if we look at the research, we see that financial well-being has been, or financial well-being, that perception of it has been cited as a key predictor of overall financial well-being. There's actually some research out there that suggests that if we only look at the objective measures of well-being, such as income, that may actually plateau at a certain level. And it's really the perceptual variables that allow us to look and examine what really drives well-being. So with this in mind, I present to you the financial wellness definition, which is defined as acting, thinking, and feeling content and fulfilled with one's financial situation. So that is the overview of the literature, the process for determining the definition, but I want to hand it over to Dr. Lutter, who is going to lead us through the consumer financial framework.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Koochel. She introduced the idea of wellness, and you see the word well-being on this slide in the visual depiction of wellness. But let's not forget that well-being is only an element of the broader framework that Dr. Koochel introduced of wellness. And the beautiful thing about this framework, from our opinion, is that it translates very well across different populations and different cultures. It's been really exciting for me sitting here looking at the Q&A. So keep popping your questions and comments over there from people across the pond who are expressing interest in this and excitement for this because it is so relatable and transferable across different populations. So when we approached financial wellness, we used the cognitive behavioral therapy model, which is what you see here, and it shows the bidirectional influences of how a person thinks about their situation and how they feel about their situation, which then influence how they act, and all vice versa. So on the left side, you see the action stage, and this is where we typically see a lot of the elements of financial planning. And these are where we are really focused on maximizing financial resources and protecting against the losses to our resources. So very objective focused, really great financial resource management things happening in that first box. And then when we move into the thinking stage up at the top, this is where a lot of the areas of psychology of financial planning come into play, and really analyzing how a person is viewing their financial situation as part of a larger system, a systemic approach here. And as a result of their prior experiences and potentially losses and so forth. And then financial well-being, different from financial wellness, is the feeling stage. And this is our view based off of extensive research that well-being is a subjective indicator of how a person feels about their situation. So wellness being the entire picture of the objective elements, the resource management, combined with the subjective elements, the well-being, and our thoughts about where we are in our current position. Definitionally, you can see here are 3 areas and how we have chosen to approach these areas with our measurement. Within the resource management, it's really that planning, organizing, allocating resources to maximize wellness, financial wellness. And then the psychosocial element, this is the thinking box. Psychological and social condition refers to the study of the mind and relationships as they pertain to resource management and financial well-being. So you see a lot of the same words that are reflective of the psychology of financial planning within that one. And then financial well-being is the state of feeling satisfied in one's financial life. And really, it's as simple as that. So someone might be objectively really well. They might be managing their resources perfectly, but yet still struggling from an overall wellness perspective because they don't feel satisfied with where they are currently. So on the next slide, you can see some of the specific areas that we analyzed within each of these 3 buckets. And we will show you some of the pilot data, as I mentioned early on. But please do keep in mind when we show you the results to some, not all of these measures or concepts, that we are not, the data that you see is not going to be representative of the larger sample that we will look into. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Heckman finally to tell us about the pilot data, how we went about that, and start giving you some of those numbers.
Great, thanks, Dr. Lutter. Yeah, so as I think Dr. Lutter pointed out, the real point with a pilot survey is simply to test our measures, make sure things make sense, that it has some of the expected relationships in terms of particular items. Are they getting at the thing that we wanted to get at? And so we just did a quick pilot using SurveyMonkey, and you can see kind of our requirements there related to the sample characteristics. This is a little bit broader sampling frame than we intend to use for the longitudinal study. I'm going to give you some more information about that coming up, but initially this was just to get some measures out there to see if things make sense. And so I'm going to try to give you just an idea of what some of these demographic characteristics look like, and then we'll also look a little bit at how some of these metrics differed by groups of categories of advice. Now, I just want to emphasize that these are not the categories that we're going to use in the long run, because we learned a lot from just running the pilot, and we have some other ideas about better ways to measure things. So with that in mind, here are some quick sort of demographic information about what the pilot looked like. We had a nice distribution in terms of gender, and you can see distribution across age categories. When we look at educational attainment, our sample had about around 34%, which is actually what US population, about 34% of US population, according to Census Bureau, has a college degree. And so it had a nice distribution in terms of education. On the relationship status, the sample is definitely overrepresenting married households, but that's typical with a pilot measure like this, or a pilot sample like this, where it's not necessarily intended to be nationally representative, but just to give you a sense of what the distribution looked like, that there was some good variation, although we had a lot more married couples in this particular run. In terms of race and ethnicity, we definitely had some groups that were underrepresented. For instance, our African American, Black, and Hispanic respondents were underrepresented. Asian households were a little bit overrepresented, but overall, we still had a pretty good variation. But I really want to emphasize, keep in mind, this is not a representative sample, and the sampling question is actually an important one for, what is our target population for the overall study? And so more on that coming up. So with that in mind, that's a little bit about how the sample was distributed. Let's start to look at some of these measures. So in the resource management variables, the idea here is that we want to get to behaviors. We want to get to how do people act, behave with their money. And you can think of these in some ways, they are perceptions, but we're trying to get at some more objective behavior. And so we have a few questions related to insurance, and the categories, I really want to emphasize, it's really the categories, kind of how the question is worded and the types of areas that we're asking about. It's really the area to pay attention to, because we do have, and I mentioned this, these are the different categories of advice, service that you could think of. So our groups right now for the pilot, we had a group of CFP professionals. The gray is CFP, that's the gold group, it's just CFP only. The gray group is CFP plus other, orange is non-CFP, and then the black bars are none, so no professional advice. And so the other thing to emphasize, these are purely descriptives. These are not, we didn't do any statistical tests to show if this is statistically significant, because again, that's not really the point of the pilot. So we're not making any inference based on this data. It's really just testing the measures. So related to personal property and disability insurance, the idea was, do you have full coverage, partial coverage? Are you self-insuring? Do you not have coverage? Do you not know? Or is it not applicable? And we think these are helpful categories because we are curious about how clients, how consumers might perceive their coverage in these areas. And then we have the same categories for life insurance, so you can kind of see how those distributed. And then I want to give a little bit of comment around retirement accounts. So we've discussed a lot about how we might measure retirement adequacy. And as you can imagine, this is a pretty complicated, a fairly nuanced area. If you want to try to assess whether a household has adequately prepared for retirement, I'm guessing most of the audience knows that's a pretty involved computation. A lot of assumptions would be needed. And so initially when we asked this question, we were really looking at we're trying to find what's a simple way that we can ask for this. And so this is relative to their annual salary saved. So we have some categories there and you can kind of see the breakdown. This one, based on kind of how we got, based on the pilot data here, we've decided that we're probably going to move more towards asking for balances, like total amount saved for retirement and perhaps present value of pensions, which we know is a little bit more complicated for folks. But if we have that information, we'd like to move more towards, if you're familiar with like a Fidelity sort of guideline of the multiple of salary saved at particular ages, we think we can take with a few simple questions about how much they've saved for retirement, take information about their age and income, and then try to develop a metric around, basically, are they in those sort of heuristics and rules of thumbs or not? And we understand that there's obviously limits around that, but one of the real challenges in running a survey like this is that you have to strike a balance between the number of questions that you're asking and getting information that's just good enough just to get a sense of where they line up, where they stack up. And so that's obviously not a perfect metric, but that's the direction that we're going to head there. And on the estate planning side, it's primarily having wills, living wills, beneficiaries, power of attorneys, just asking if they have these important documents in place. And then one of the last areas to highlight here on the resource management side, we felt like it was important to get at the perception of basically how they're doing from a cash flow perspective and just an overall perception of how they're able to manage financially. And so you can see that we're asking them about if they have money left over at the end of the month, and then just their perception on whether they're managing financially. And so you'll notice I didn't spend a lot of time making comparisons between those categories, and there's good reason for that. And so here in a bit, I'll preview our next pilot in terms of how we're going to go about measuring these key services, key groups, and the differences between them. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Lutter to talk through our psychosocial variables from the pilot study.
Or in other words, how people are thinking about their money from a psychological and social perspective. So across the board, we saw fairly good similarities among our different groups in terms of people's anxiety and socialization. We were really looking at the reliability of these scales, which is at 0.85 for both, which is very good reliability. One of the questions in the chat that I will address right now is, what is the CFP plus other group? We allowed respondents to select from a list of professionals of who they're getting their financial advice from. And if people selected a CFP professional and maybe a banker or an insurance agent or somebody else, an accountant was a fairly common one, then that's what we're capturing with the CFP plus other. So as Dr. Heckman mentioned, we will come back to that at the end of how we plan to address that going forward. From a kind of how do people think about financial crises and how is it that they are receiving support? This is partially financial socialization that we're capturing here. Who are the people in your life that you can rely upon? And we're seeing fairly good distributions across those categories as well. So nothing too revealing there or anything that we really wanted to change with that particular question. There's always a question with these types of data sets of who is the primary financial decision maker and what does that mean if they're doing the bulk of the conversation with the financial professional. So for this particular question, we did want to look at it by gender and kind of let that inform how we were thinking about primary financial decision maker. And the data align fairly similarly to what we see in other types of studies, to where males are reporting more that they make the decisions, whereas females are more likely to report that they're sharing the financial decisions. And yet there's this other group of people who says that the partner is making the decisions, which isn't exactly parallel with who said that they're making the decisions. So all of that to say, this is fairly representative of other samples that we have seen, so nothing too alarming with that question either. Generally speaking, with this particular question on people's financial confidence or their confidence in their ability to achieve their financial goals, we see that the use of a professional advisor seems to boost confidence and people's ability to achieve their financial goals. Nothing too surprising there either. This one is probably my absolute favorite data slide because while I said don't use the pilot data, maybe you can kind of use this one a little bit just because it's so exciting and it definitely represents other data that I have collected. And what we see here is that the use of a financial advisor, a CFP professional particularly, has some sort of correlation with people's relationship and or marriage satisfaction, which is pretty cool that we are seeing some relational benefits of talking about finances with another person. And specifically, at least with this pilot data with the CFP professional, is among the highest. So we're excited to dig into that in the ongoing data as well. And then briefly, I'll turn it over to Dr. Koochel to talk about the well-being variables, and then we'll get into some of those bigger issues.
Great, thank you. So in the financial well-being section, I'll have you go to the next slide here. In this section, we're looking to really capture an individual's state of feeling satisfied in their financial life. And when we think about financial life, going back to kind of the previous conversation, is that this is going to capture their past, current, and future states. How are you feeling? We're identifying that people generally will take in to that thought, past, current, and future. So this time period, or sorry, this will inform their current time period, how they're feeling presently. The responses for these questions range from not satisfied to completely satisfied. And what you'll see here is all of the items really had good response rates. There was perceived little confusion over any of the wordings of the questions. So the intention is to take these questions moving forward. We will also be looking at how someone feels about their financial situation, as well as how their partner looks at that same situation. And we'll be comparing those two responses to see if there is any alignment in that. So is one person having the same perceived financial well-being or satisfaction as their partner? Moving to just the final variable inside of the financial well-being area. Here we have the ideal financial life. So the question being, how close to your ideal financial life are you presently? So the concept when we're thinking about this is we all have who we hope to be on our best day. We have our ideal financial self, and this is where everything is going right. We're headed straight towards our goals. But part of that human condition is that we all aren't perfect, and our behavior doesn't always align with that. And so what we're trying to understand is some of this discrepancy between the real and ideal states, as well as their assessment of their past and current and future states, which is really important when we consider financial decisions and some of that trade-off that happens between the present and future self. So this is the question for ideal financial state. With that, we are heading into the efficacy of financial planning. So I'll hand it back over to Stu to talk about essentially the second part of this study.
Great, thanks. And yeah, maybe I'll back up just one slide real quick, because there are a few questions kind of about these different categories. And one aspect of the pilot that really made us reflect on, we knew this was going to be one of the real challenges, but even seeing this data, when we try to compare just CFP to CFP plus another professional, like I consult with my certified financial planning professional and also some other professional advisor, it really highlights in my mind one of the real challenges of this research, which is to make comparisons that are similar. Like we want to be able to compare the right types of services. So what could be happening on some of these, and you might have noticed that the CFP plus other group all will tend to have pretty high metrics. It could be related to the comprehensiveness of the services and the number of areas that are being addressed. And so as we move forward, thinking about how are we going to determine the efficacy, the differences, especially the causal effect of working with a financial planning professional, and especially a CFP professional, how are we going to get to that? How are we going to identify that difference? So just to kind of remind you where we're at. So that early part, the first part of our presentation really covered the framework on the our financial wellness framework, which we really consider to be the outcome. Because one of the important things here is we got to determine what is the outcome that we're most interested in comparing across all these different individuals and these different treatments. And so in the short run, which is really this year, Our plan is to have this initial cross-section of the client well-being, client financial wellness data, and then to start to get to measures that we can compare different types of services and the outcomes associated with those. And then in the long run, having the longitudinal data that will allow us to make comparisons over time. So one of the key comparisons, of course, is between CFP and non-CFP financial professionals. But again, we want to make those the services that those two groups are providing comparable, because the services provided by even CFP professionals are not the same across the board. And so that's really on our mind, that we really need to account for that. And a real key challenge, anytime you want to estimate differences in outcomes between different groups with data like this, is accounting for the fact that people have selected into the treatment. And so what I mean by that is, if we just compare people that choose to work with a professional or even a particular kind of professional to groups that have not, our estimation of those differences is biased by the fact that people were not randomly assigned to these groups, that they have self-selected into receiving the treatment, which in this case would be financial planning services of some kind. And so this is I'd say one of the foundational issues in all research, that especially if you're going to try to use non-experimental data where you're randomly assigning folks, this is going to be a key challenge that you've got to sort through. And so our approach here is to start with, what are the known problems or the known determinants of people selecting into whether they're going to work with a financial professional. And so from the research literature, I have a number of these factors listed here on the screen: that their income and wealth, that their cognitive ability, their level of financial literacy, their risk preferences, and then I'm calling them barriers to seeking advice. And there was a comment in the Q&A about this: anxiety about meeting with a financial advisor, for instance, that these things all impact the likelihood of whether somebody chooses to work with a financial professional. And if we have researchers on the call, you can see some of the obvious problems here. A lot of previous studies have been interested, well, does working with a financial planner impact your wealth? Well, if wealth happens to determine the likelihood of using a financial planner in the first place, and we can imagine a number of explanations for why that might be the case. For instance, AUM, if we charge based on AUM, we're more likely to work with higher wealth individuals. So it makes it challenging. You can't just compare the group that's working with advisors and not working with advisors. So we're spending a lot of time on the selection side here, trying to determine what are the factors that we can account for so that we can match individuals, that we can make them more comparable, that we can get better comparisons ultimately. So besides the selection issues, one of the other real challenges that I've alluded to when trying to determine the efficacy of working with a financial planning professional is we're calling it treatment measurement problems, I guess. And kind of our approach here is, how are we going to determine what services that we're going to capture? How are we going to account for the fact that services vary pretty broadly between financial planners, between financial planning firms, and how those services are structured? And I think that issue was highlighted in the pilot data, where we're trying to make sense of what do these results mean when we compare these categories. So the idea and the plan, and this is where we're at we're working on our second pilot that's really testing the features related to this efficacy portion of the project. So we're testing selection variables and we're testing treatment variables. And so our plan is to take the principal knowledge topic areas from the CFP board as these are the areas that we want to measure the extent to which the services engage, implement in these different areas. So what I mean by that is, and you can go down to the bottom of the slide there, just draw your attention there. So for each principal knowledge topic area, our plan is to measure within each area the depth of the engagement, how frequently they're working on that engagement, and then who has implementation responsibility. So for instance, you can think of investment management. Am I providing advice and then the client is responsible for implementing that? Or am I providing the advice and also implementing it? I'm opening the accounts, making the trades, et cetera. And so we want to do that for each principal knowledge topic area. We feel like that's our best shot to get to the kinds of comparisons that that really make for clean comparisons so that we can then measure differences in the outcome while trying to sort out some of the biases there, really accounting for those differences. So in addition to that, we'll also be capturing information about their certifications and qualifications and what other sources of information that they're using, in addition to maybe a professional engagement. So that's a huge topic for us. So as we try to get to measuring these differences, we're really looking at those selection issues and these treatment issues, the fact that not everybody has the same treatment when they sign up for financial planning services. There's a lot of variation here. And so we really, in our survey and our instruments, we really need to be able to capture those differences in order to make the right comparisons. So the other aspect that I want to highlight related to the longitudinal study is that we started with the mass affluent definition that's commonly used in financial services. And you can see that there on the left side of the screen, that they're US households age 36 to 65, and then there's minimum household income and assets, and minimum education, which is post-secondary education. And we're usually interested in currently employed or recently retired as part of this mass affluent definition. And this is still one thing that we're discussing internally in the research team, and that we anticipate continuing to have conversations with as we are in the process of selecting our data vendor provider that's actually going to collect the data. We're interested in altering those specifications, those parameters, to get to a population that we think is representative of the types of clients that are typically targeted by financial planning professionals, CFP professionals, in order to really have some, a broad enough scope here on our sample, so we can have some good inference and really increase the impact. So initially, what we've done is we've lowered the age and income and asset requirements, and we've also lowered the education to high school or equivalent, and then just added some specificity to the recently retired. And so early on, it looks like that really increases, in kind of our initial estimates, it really increases the number of households that might fall into that target population. But again, this is really something that we're going to continue to work on, and we would invite conversation if you have comments on, what you would like to see in that target population. We'd be happy to take those suggestions. And I'll also highlight, you can put it in the Q&A, but there's also a feedback form on the website, and there'll be a QR code at the end of the presentation that you'll be able to add your comments there. So then a couple other comments before we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. I wanted to highlight that one thing the research team's really been discussing is it would be really ideal to have some match data where we have a professional, an advisor or planner, and their specific client in the sample. Now, there's a lot of challenges to doing this, and we've started to hear about the challenges to doing that in our request for proposals. But we think this is important because I spent a lot of time talking about the treatment differences, really the fact that these services vary really widely, and we're concerned about that. We need good data there if we're going to be able to make the comparisons that we want. And our concern is that clients and professionals may have different perceptions about the services that are offered, how they're being, what that engagement looks like for them. And so we would really love to, whether it's still, a single wave in this overall study or a couple of waves, we'd really love to have the opportunity to compare how a client perceives the services compared to that professional, just to help us address that heterogeneity, the variation that you see in financial planning services. And then I've included here a quick table that gives you a sense of, these are really the categories that we're looking to compare, that we want to be able to compare clients and basically the respondents that work with CFP professionals, non-CFP professionals, the DIY folks, and then the group that uses nothing, no professional sources of advice. And then we want to be able to compare planners. So we're going to have a planner survey as well among CFP professionals and non-CFP professionals. And one of the other comments that I'll address here that I saw in the Q&A, there was a question about whether people will be moving in and out of these categories over the 10-year period. And yes, absolutely, that is actually one of the highlights of working with longitudinal data, is that that switching behavior when people move between these categories are actually a great spot for researchers to identify the effects that we're interested in. So we'll definitely be paying attention to that, and we're excited to be looking, for those types of movements over time. And with that really concludes our overview of kind of where we're at. We're excited to solidify who's our data partner going to be moving forward, the group that's actually going to sample and collect the data. And then as we're in that process, we're working on finalizing our survey instruments, and we'll be rolling out our second pilot here before too long. So that will go out to consumers with some of the same measures from the first part, but also testing these service questions, and then it'll also go out to professionals. And with that, here's the QR code. This QR code will take you to the client impact study web portion of the CFP Board website. And if you scroll to the bottom, there is a feedback form there where you're welcome to add comments and questions there. And maybe I'll take a pause and kick it over to Dr. Roth. Were there other questions that you'd like for the research team to address here that we have a few minutes in the Q&A?
Yes. First of all, thank you for the presentation, and thank you to the attendees for a very lively conversation, at least the Q&A they've been pushing through. One of the questions that's kind of popping through that may be worth clarifying a little bit is, you went through a little bit of the test data, that you discussed, the pilot survey, and people were excited by some of the results that you saw there. And, obviously the caveats that this was a pilot survey, and partially you're really just testing the questions, and the answers, the data that was coming back is more for entertainment purposes, I guess we would probably say in this context. Can you expand a little bit more about, because there were some concerns about self-selection of basically people participating in that survey, and that's not going to necessarily be an issue when we work with our research partner, survey partner for the panel. Can you kind of expand upon that a little bit, maybe to allay some of those concerns?
Sure, and let me make sure I'm following the question. So concern about self-selecting into that pilot, or self-selecting into maybe those groups of who they're working with, or are all those kind of part of the question?
Essentially, is that obviously people self-selected into the pilot survey
Sure.
at some extent. They had decided to participate. That won't necessarily be as much of an issue with the panel that we're working with the outside firm. So
right, yeah. So
presumably.
the nice thing about working with professional data collection firm is that many of these groups have ongoing panels that are set up that they've actually recruited through sampling methods, and so while that's always an issue with any type of volunteer survey participation, that this is a concern about the people selecting into the sample. But that's part of the reason why, if we give a target population, the idea is that then we want to make sure that the sample characteristics line up with that target population, so that our inference is representative of that group. And so if there's any systematic selecting into participation, that should be clear when we look at our sample and compare that to the sample or the target population that we had in mind, based on demographics and things like that. So there are things that we can do to, I guess, allay those concerns, and I think the data vendor is going to be really helpful on that front as well. And Dr. Koochel and Dr. Lutter, feel free to add anything you want to that.
That was spot on, Dr. Heckman. Thanks. There was another comment in the Q&A about treatment of married versus single households that I think is really worthwhile. And I definitely want to acknowledge that in talking to the data vendor about making sure that our minimums are appropriate for both single households and married households.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Another question, a couple of themes I'm seeing some questions about what would we be doing to help control for household wealth? The questioner, at least one specifically, said that they expected confidence and possibly even marital contentment would be higher among households that had more resources, and also made a comment that higher income households may have more choice for advisors to support them. A, your thoughts about that comment, but also B, in general, what do you see as being the controls for a possible effect, for that possible effect?
Yeah, great insight there. Those are things that we're thinking about. So we do have questions regarding income, investable assets, and those are really important controls. I think that moving forward, matching along some of those key characteristics, and this is really where a lot of the research tools come into play. And you're right that wealthier households have more opportunities and options when it comes to advice. And so in an ideal world, we would have households grouped up in ways that they're very similar to each other. Some of those key metrics would include income and wealth. And then ideally, we would have people that have sorted into using advisors, not using advisors, that look similar otherwise. And that's hopefully where some of the key comparisons can be made. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but those are some of the really key background selection factors that we have to account for.
I've seen a couple of comments on here asking about whether this recording will be available. Yes, we will be posting this on YouTube. The same landing page that was mentioned before is you could find all our resources on the study, but specifically from the website, just go to the client impact study page. That will be coming off our key initiatives. We'll take you to, basically we'll be the home to for all of our resources on here.
As you're scrolling through
please.
the questions, Dr. Roth, just to point out, the QR code that's on your screen right now takes you directly to that page. And also on that page, in addition to providing feedback, our first paper is up there that goes into more depth of the methodology we use for Pilot 1. So if folks are interested in that, they could get it from this QR code.
Thank you. One of the other questions I saw in there, kind of picking up on the theme that you've already brought up in this presentation, is not only about people changing cohorts, moving from maybe being someone do-it-yourself to working with a CFP professional, is someone to ask the question about would we be controlling for how long someone's had a relationship, perhaps with a CFP professional or a non-CFP financial advisor? Is that something we'll be seeing to control?
Yes, good question. And yeah, that is part of the plan right now in the first wave, especially to ask them for how long these engagements because we have a lot of questions around the engagement, the professional engagement that they have, that they're reporting on. And so part of that is asking how long has this been going on? We feel that's especially important in the first wave for accounting for the fact that this could be a brand new relationship, or maybe this is ongoing for 15 years prior. And obviously that's a big difference. So we will have a look back period to try to capture, the extent of the history of that.
One more question that kind of caught my eye that I think maybe worth talking about briefly. It was one of the first questions we received. Is a little bit about the difference between financial wellness and financial satisfaction.
Yeah, that is a great question. Dr. Lutter or Dr. Koochel, would you like to address that?
Sure. I saw that one come through too. So thanks for bringing that one up, Kevin. And I think this is such a huge part of misunderstanding within the field. And maybe it's not even misunderstanding, but just confusion about how we're using the terms currently. So thinking about our framework, we really have three big areas of objective elements of the financial process, how people are thinking about the process, and how people feel about the process. So this element of how people feel about their financial situation really is that client well-being, which is just one single element, that subjective element, combined with person's thoughts about their overall situation and then how they're managing their resources, that action stage or resource management stage. So I think you could very much think of financial well-being as similar to financial satisfaction. In fact, we even use the word satisfaction within the definition of financial well-being.
Probably time for perhaps one or two more questions. One I see here talks a little bit about the longitudinal nature of the study, both in terms of how we may be controlling for a family household having children, saving for college and so forth. But also B, there was a question earlier about generational change, and specifically called out medical, the cost for medical services and so forth. And I guess I'm making a comment, but also kind of seeing where the question, our question is. But basically, are those some of the items we'll be looking forward to basically trying to capture, in the study?
Yes, we do have, I think, basic just household information. And so, number of people in the household that should be captured. Medical costs specifically, that's an interesting one. I'm going to put that down for us to think about, because one of the challenges is, of course, we have to balance the number of things that we're asking about. So, but I appreciate the comment. I think that's helpful. We'll keep that in mind. And maybe another question that I saw that I think is especially worth highlighting is around the difference in regulation at the state level. And so one of the key features that we'd really like to build into the survey are state identifiers, so that as there are regulatory changes at the state level over time, we might be able to capture and at least lend itself to some sort of policy analysis methods where we can see what's the impact. And so, yes, we really would love to build in state identifiers to be able to take advantage of that, because certainly there will be changes over a 10-year period.
I just want to call out like two more questions here, but actually as one, and note that also to everyone that we are saving the questions here. Every question that's sitting here, every comment that's here is going to help support the researchers on the work. There are two questions here that just kind of caught my eye. Will we be asking participants about their own definition of financial planning? And then kind of related to for those that hired a CFP professional or a non-CFP professional advisor, why did they do that? What were their expectations essentially?
Yeah, great question. Dr. Koochel, I think you had questions in that area. Do you recall from the pilot that we're about to roll out, pilot 2, what we might ask around that?
Yeah, we did. So one of the things that we know in terms of when somebody begins working with a financial professional is that they're often prompted by a major life event or some type of recommendation, whether that comes from a family, a friend, or another financial professional that said, hey, I think it would be great if you started working with, a CFP. So we do actually ask the question of what prompted you to start working with a financial professional with some of those as options. In addition to that, of course, whether that was through an advertisement or social media, and really trying to understand what is it that brings somebody in to initiate contact with the financial professional.
Well, terrific. Go ahead, please.
I'll touch on just one other, I think the first question, which also was asking about kind of the definition of the financial plan, which we also try to get at in understanding the type of financial planning, engagement, and service that the professional is providing, and also asking that on the client or the consumer side to have them identify the types of service or experience that they're having with a financial professional to see if there is some alignment there or if there's any discrepancies in the perception of the services that they believe that they're getting. So we also touch on that just for pilot 2 as well.
Thank you, and thank you for this fascinating presentation today. As we're coming up to the top of the hour, I do want to one last time call out the QR code that's here that will bring you to a place to share further feedback about the study, or frankly the webinar itself too. Otherwise, we look forward to moving forward with this project, including our first survey coming up later this summer, and be sharing results further down the road with the public. And with that, I thank you for joining us today.